Hello, all you beautiful people out there. So, there's been a lot of chatter recently about XP and should she be nerfed. So, the main point that this originally came up on is Kaido today, they had gotten a 73 million point score on Shadowfire versus 43 million, which was the previous top, which is a significant jump. I mean, that is a difference of almost double. It's really close to double, 10 million off. So then the question becomes, how should we nerf her? When should we nerf her? And honestly, should we nerf her? So on the first question of how we should nerf, this is always a hard question, because from the monetary perspective of a gacha game, if you are to attempt to nerf a character after people have spent monetary investment in it, they do not want to come back and spend on your game again, which is bad. Anyone who is supporting this game, who wants this game to thrive, you want people to keep spending in this. Even if you're free to play, you want the whales to keep spending, because they are who are allowing everyone to continue playing it. They are the money. If you're not paying for the game, you're not their customer, really. At that point, you are part of their numbers that they use to attract additional players into the game, so you are useful in the terms of content, as well as whales need someone to farm. And ultimately, you want the whales in this game, because they are who are giving a large amount of money. And it's not even necessarily the whales. The moderate spenders, the goldfish, and the dolphins are actually probably a larger chunk of the cash that come into the game. Anyone out here who's buying the monthly passes, the gold cards, the Nexus crystal card, you are the ones keeping this game going. Please continue that. If you like this game, just keep supporting it monetarily. That's how we're able to keep it alive. Okay, so then it comes to a question of how do we ethically nerf someone when there is this money on the line? And it's not impossible to do. I mean, you can do anything if you set your mind to it. In this case, how you'd be able to ethically nerf her is anyone, you give a rewind token, same as they have done in the past, but in this case, instead of making it a rewind the shimmer, it would just be choose a new shimmer. So like you would rewind it, she would fall off your account, then you're just able to choose a new shimmer per copy that you have. And that would make anyone who had her happy with the nerf, because then they would all just immediately go grab a copy of Nushi. Or in the case of whales, they would immediately R6 another shimmer Esper. They would love it. So she's already been nerfed once, and it was nerfed correctly in that they separated PvP and PvE. They wanted her to be a PvP monster with additional synergy with DPS in order to make them more valid to overcome the tank meta, which they've artificially inflated through the 25% HP. If they didn't do that, then her numbers could have been significantly smaller naturally. In PvE, they have her number at 25% damage increase, which is really good, as well as 25% on the defense break. And I think that's a fairly good spot for her to be at in terms of nerfing. Generally, you'd want to overreach on a nerf so that you can buff afterwards. But they didn't want to go too far on it, because you also want people to still buy her. It's a very interesting dance that you have to do. And this brings us to the big question. When should we nerf? Now, there's a lot of different thoughts that go into this. There's a lot of people that are for very quick balance changes. Riot does this a lot in their models, especially like if you were in early days of TFT, they would just shotgun out changes. If they didn't like how a character was looking that week, they would immediately put out a change, see what happens. And if they overshot it, well, they'd go back and buff them right afterwards. But there's really no financial incentive there, so you don't really have to be too concerned about nerfing. Because nobody spent money on your game other than the skins of the avatar that you're using, but the characters themselves they're not as invested in. The other model is commonly seen as the long-term model, where like if we're to look at StarCraft 2. Blizzard's balance team, how they went about it is if a matchup was below 5% sustained over about a month-long period, then they would actually look at doing changes. and they would do very minor changes, and then again, wait and see where the meta shifts. Wait and see where the meta shifts. Now, there's always a middle ground between these two, and I'm a fan of the middle ground because you do want to wait for a meta to kind of set. We ran into that issue in 3.1.7, where they did massive changes with the resonance system and also buffed HP, which was less of a buff for tanks and more of a nerf against cleave, when they already nerfed cleave by introducing R6 Sally. So you do want to give time for a meta to kind of settle down, see where everyone's at, and try and avoid those general knee-jerk reactions on it. Now, there's also another nuance, because generally you want it to be nerfed whenever there's too large of a gap between that character and the next character in their slot, because that is a prime example of imbalance. This is why I believe, like, Nushi needs to be nerfed. Her S3 has 4 hits, and each hit can strip. And then there's also the CD up on it. Now, the CD up aside, 4 hits was a power creep. They've set precedent that triple hitting was the way to go. So you can tell immediately that there is a very equivalent buff, or very equivalent Esper, that she just is better than. Just absolutely, unequivocally better than. So that's where you look at it. It's like, well, that is a gap. That is a problem. That is definitely power creep. That is something that should ultimately be nerfed due to that level of power creep. Now, there is another weird spot, which I believe that Windows XP falls into here, in that she offers something that others do not. So nobody can take her place, which is a problem, but at the same time, it's also required for the evolution of a game to introduce new mechanics that are imbalanced in this case because nobody else can do them. You have to have this character in order to be able to do them. Like Horse in PvE, 25% buff. Nobody else has a gold-rimmed 25% buff that they can put on the damage on turn 1. And that's unique. So that's definitely part of the items we're going to be looking at here. Another major item in here, the one that could actually be nerfed, I would say is General. So General we do have an equivalency of in Alice. This is an ability that is in the game, Calling to Assist. Alice does it every single S1, and it's considered to be fairly powerful, but she can't do it inside of her S3. So there is many limits on it, and it's not even a 100% chance. The power creep here is that she has a 100% chance to call in a Esper to support, and not only that, she does it on all 3 abilities. So it's just the better version of Alice, significantly better version of Alice. Now, there is a bit of a gray area here in the fact that Alice is an epic and she is a legendary, so you could argue that the jump between epic and legendary would include a 100% chance. And so there is a bit of gray area there, but at the same time, if you're also looking at it from a holistic standpoint, if you have other abilities on top of it, yeah, definitely absurd power creep comparatively, even at a legendary level. Like if you're looking at a legendary Alice, it would be basically just the general ability, where include crit rate up on this and give general, and bam, you have legendary Alice. So by having other items also in the kit, she's clearly a massive power creep over Alice. And then whether or not that is considered to be acceptable, going from a epic to what's basically a mythic tier jump there. Then her second ability, now this is the really curious one to me, is Cannon. And it's a huge part of why people are able to get super duper high scores on her, is because 25% defense ignore is massive. We talked about this before, where at 0 defense is 3.15 times damage, 1400 defense, at least I think it was 1400 defense, is 1 times damage. And then it can scale all the way down to approaching 0 at infinity. So, being able to ignore defense is huge. Now, the thing is, there's no other Esper in the game that can do this ignore defense. So she more or less has 2 very important unique buffs. One being Horse, that she's buffing the damage of the DPS by 25%, which is, good. and then Cannon, which lets them ignore 25% of their defense. These are both very unique buffs. Now, this has enabled her to do pretty absurd burst damage. Now, I'm not 100% on this. I have not seen Kaido's run. I don't even know if there's a recording of Kaido's run out there. But if I had to bet my bottom dollar, the reason why we see such a huge jump in score is because against Chloe, they probably did Horse up and then got XP to do Cannon immediately afterwards, pushing Chloe, and then Chloe's probably even got the assist on General. Then with the 25% damage buff, 25% defense ignore, you end up with, because since it's a 70% damage gap, that's probably about 70% damage right there, which is a fairly large jump just because defense ignore is so good, and it seems abnormally good, especially against the Shadowfire boss, because you cannot do a defense down. So this is literally the only way to ignore defense other than Byaedema or Narmer, which you're not going to bring either of them to Shadowfire for a lot of different reasons. So, with unique buffs, it becomes really questionable on when you nerf, because if you are unique, you are either useless, or, well, we'll call it niche, or you're irreplaceable, because literally no one else can do what you do. And in this case, XP becomes irreplaceable, because it's high damage, and then even higher damage right afterwards with Cannon. So she is ultimately irreplaceable. But the big but here is that if a character is unique, that is required for the game to grow. Because this isn't to say that we won't eventually have another Esper come out that their buff that they give to an Esper is ignore 40% of defense, like what Narmer has on his passive. And that would just be by default better than Cannon, and would be able to give those large numbers, and XP is suddenly no longer irreplaceable because she's no longer giving a completely unique buff. So when we are looking at when should we nerf, it becomes a very hard question to look at. The main time we would look at it for a unique character is if the power gap that they introduce is magnitudes better than anything else you can be able to get outside of niche situations. So like in the case of XP, if she was putting up twice the score of literally any other team comp, yeah, 100% should be nerfed. 100%. Because that would be a massive power balance gap. Which when she was at 100% damage, yeah, that was a massive power gap. They nerfed her by, 75% on that damage, which was a very good way to go about it in PvE. But we're not really seeing her at that point just yet. So we had a 70% increase in score on Shadowfire, but it's also a bit of a niche situation due to the fact that she's the only one that can give defense ignore against a boss that cannot be defense broken. So it's really hard to call it there. Because you want uniqueness, because you want the game to expand, but you also don't want to go too far. But in this case, we're able to kind of seclude it to that high score over there, where we're saying, okay, we have Shadowfire. That's definitely a problem. Now, is she a problem elsewhere, or is she just good? For the most part, she is just good. Because one of the main items we need to look at when comparing whether or not an Esper should be nerfed is, should anything that is permanent on the leaderboards be nerfed? So, like in this case, we go over and we look at Chronos. Yeah, XP is being used. She also helped my team comp. I'm currently number 1, woohoo, at 13. And she dropped off 2 turns on my clear and made it way more consistent. She's really good. But is she better than R6 Brewster? It is much easier to hit an XP statistically than it is to hit an R6 Brewster. So in this case, it's kind of who's the real clutch here, or is she just supporting? In this case, I would say the R6 Brewster is the main clutch in like Chronos. But as you see, she's not even at number 1 right now. But like, let's go look at APAP. world formation here. And we got to scroll far here. Like, I think I went down to 20 earlier and wasn't seeing her. Yeah, we don't got her. We don't got her. We don't got her. We don't got her. Yeah, we don't got her. So APEP, she's not the person in APEP. So then we look at Fafnir. And granted, these are all subject to change. Because people do better, people will do worse as the Spire saga goes on. She's only been out for a few days. People are learning how to use her. We look through Fafnir. Yeah, we're not going to see a single copy of her again. But we'll see a bunch of Mateo. And then you also have to question, well, R6 Mateo looks like he's now going to be, and R2 YC are absolutely required for high score on Fafnir. Are they imbalanced? No, it's really only this board that they're completely showing up on. I guess as well as Sentinel Hunt, which I've not really been able to use her too much in just yet. But again, a lot of high scores are going to be using YC too. So then it's like, well, do you nerf YC just because he's the best damage that you can get on Sentinel Hunt on these longer bosses? And then if she also shows up on the board. So if she's not dominating everywhere, it's obvious that it's not a systemic issue with her kit. That it spans from certain locations, and the main one in this case would be the Desert Lands, due to the fact that the boss cannot be debuffed. And since the boss cannot be debuffed, it means that any buff you can give is going to just magnify on these bosses. So if you're to look at it, yeah, she's going to show up on all of these just consistently. So I'm going to leave it to you guys to decide. Obviously, in PvP, she's absolutely nuts. She's not as good as Nushi, because Nushi only has to get a turn. XP has to have her cleaves get the turn after, so she gets hard countered by Ashley Nushi. But outside that, she's really good at PvP, and I think that as they introduce more damaging espers, she will become better and better and better over time. Right now, I'm running her with Narmer and getting at 5 stack, 6 stack Narmer. I'm hitting almost as hard as I was at 12 stacks, which is ridiculous. But that is where it's at right now. So I'll leave it to y'all to decide whether or not she is worthy of a nerf at this point after this discussion here, and kind of what level she should be nerfed. Like, I would argue that if we were to nerf her, that the nerf would ultimately be on her S3 general ability, to be a % chance and do the check in the same way as Alice, where it starts with character slot 1, then goes over to character slot 5, doing a roll each time. Because general is clearly a massive power creep comparative to Alice. Even at a legendary level, since we're stacking everything else on top of it, it's too much of a power creep. The power gap between those who can do the same thing is there. But again, unique buffs, we do want unique. Unique means that they've opened the door. Now there may be another Esper that does the same thing, but better. So again, leaving it up to y'all. I hope y'all have a fantastic morning, evening, afternoon, test, whatever you're doing today. Goodbye.